We start by building up the trigger group. The pivot pins are printed on a flat base, so they aren't perfectly round, but they can be mounted in either orientation. The trigger has 2 holes, allowing the rubber band that drives it to be weaved through until a suitable tension is reached. Note that the final pass of the rubber band does have to be through the rear hole. The other end of the rubber band is wrapped around the lever that drives the switching mechanism for the slide lock. Another band is added connecting the wobbler to the lifter. The lifter is of course a real part in a SPAS-12, although mine looks different because my lifting mechanism is different. The wobbler is unique to my mechanism. Next, we assemble the safety catch. This is the pin style design and not the earlier and far more dangerous lever style. After that, we continue adding components into the mechanism, another pin, the trigger itself, and then we can add the slide lock. And then we begin what is really the most irritating part of the whole assembly procedure. That is getting the other side of the trigger mechanism frame in while keeping all the different components in the right places. A quick mechanism check here, and I'm noticing that the slide lock doesn't quite feel right, and that's due to the rubber band not being seated correctly. I tweaked that with the front end pin, and now it's fine. Continuing on, and we add the 2 rings that hold the trigger mechanism frame together. They stop the trigger mechanism from splitting when the pistol grip is opened during disassembly. We pull the trigger, and that allows us to slide in the trigger link, and now we can do a full function test. The slide lock locks in the forward and backward positions. Pulling the trigger pulls the slide lock back, and the safety catch stops the trigger from being pulled altogether. Now we pull in 1/2 of the pistol grip, and this needs to be a really snug fit because the pistol grip itself is only connected to the receiver via the trigger mechanism frame. So any play in the joints from the receiver to the trigger mechanism frame, and then from the trigger mechanism frame to the pistol grip, will add up, and that will cause the whole gun to feel wobbly. Now we add the stock locking spring, and then with the help of the friction pins, we can close the whole pistol grip up. One final function check, and we are good to go. Next, we assemble the hammer as part of the firing mechanism. I've used the same type of rubber band here that drives the lifter mechanism, but now they're paired up for length and then doubled up. So we actually have 4 bands powering the hammer, and this gives the gun some real oomph when it fires. Another doubled up set of bands is going to drive the magazine follower, and again I'm going to use the front end pin to help me pull the rubber band through. However, before we can actually assemble these into the firing mechanism, we have one last minor assembly to do, and that is getting the pulley into place on the right-hand side of the firing mechanism frame. Using a pulley here allows us to use a long rubber band for the magazine follower, and that in turn allows us to have a much more consistent spring tension in the magazine, and that is something that we really feel while loading cartridges. The pulley is mounted on an axle, which is actually just a normal piece of filament that's been cut to length. Next, we mount both sets of rubber bands onto an extender piece. Having this extender piece separate allows us to flip it during assembly and disassembly, and this allows us to control the amount of tension in the system while we work on it. The bands for the hammer are held in place by a printed pin for strength, while the weaker rubber band that drives the magazine follower is held in place by another piece of filament cut to length. It's important to apply a number of twists to the collection of hammer rubber bands. This makes it feel more like a single rope instead of a collection of bands, and we'll see why that's important later. Next goes in the TPU impact buffer, and then the hammer release mechanism, which most importantly has to go in flat side down. With the other mechanism side added, we can now do a test to check that the magazine follower is smoothly moving back and forth and hasn't been twisted. Similarly, we check that the hammer release moves smoothly, and then we flip the extender to add more pre-tension to the mechanism. I'm now bringing in the pre-glued heat shield and adding some of its subcomponents. So that's the rear sight that gets pulled in place from below, and then the charging door. And then before the firing mechanism can go in, I need to add the outer casing of the handover mechanism. The firing mechanism slides in, but not all the way yet. First, we need to install the handover mechanism. Its purpose is to allow us to have a bolt stroke that is about the same as on a real SPAS-12, but a foregrip stroke that is much longer. The benefit of that comes from the fact that the foregrip stroke is the same as the hammer stroke. A long hammer stroke means a nice powerful firing mechanism. It's now time to add the primer to the firing mechanism. This is a multi-step procedure. First, we have to prime the hammer by poking the primer through the hole in the side of the heat shield and pulling the hammer back until it clicks. Next, we have to slide the firing mechanism rearwards until the notch in the firing mechanism frame lines up with the notch in the heat shield. Use the hook part of the primer to pull the rubber bands out through the slot in the heat shield, where it's useful that we already twisted the rubber bands together like one single rope. Once they're out, we can hook them into their right place on the primer and then insert it into the gap in the heat shield, moving the handover mechanism into place as well so that the primer can be fully seated. Now, when the foregrip drives the primer will drive the handover mechanism. Here I fully insert the firing mechanism to check that the primer is able to slide smoothly through its full range of motion. Note that at this point the hammer is primed, so we do need to be careful while handling the assembly. Now we're going to assemble the extractor into the bolt. It's simply held in place with a T-pin. The bolt clips directly onto the handover mechanism, and the two symmetrical trigger bars slide into the receiver. These bars are what connect the trigger to the hammer release mechanism, and therefore it's important that they do slide freely. The holes on the end of the trigger bars fit over the pins on the sides of the hammer release, and with those in place, we can slide the receiver against the firing mechanism. Before sliding the receiver fully into the heat shield, we need to add the clasps. These will hold the receiver to the firing mechanism, and then the clasps get held in place by the heat shield. We can now safely deprime the hammer by pulling back the primer and using the notches on the heat shield pin to pull the hooks on the trigger bars, and then we can safely guide the hammer forward again under tension. So now the trigger bars are loose again. We now add the curved pin that holds the firing mechanism in place in the heat shield, and now we can prepare to add the trigger group that we assembled earlier. The handed loading pins go in first, though. Their purpose is to ensure that exactly one cartridge is extracted from the magazine during loading. They fit into slots in the side of the receiver, and then they get held in place by the trigger group when it follows. We need to check that the safety is on and that the trigger bars are both in their fully rearward position. With that all good, we can slide the trigger group diagonally into the receiver, checking as we do that the loading fins don't fall out of their slots. That then gets held in place by two pins. These again need to be quite stiff fits because they are the critical load path between the receiver and the pistol grip. Now we can slide in our sequencing rods. These are driven by the foregrip, and they are what force the loading fins to bend in and out at the right moments. They clip into place due to their own elasticity. The tabs will fit into notches in the foregrip, and that will synchronize their movements. Just like the heat shield, the foregrip has been pre-glued, so we're going to treat it as one component here. The foregrip is mounted on two runners, and these fit into the grooves on the heat shield, and then they connect directly to the primer. So this creates the connection between the foregrip and the primer. We do need to make sure that the tabs on the sequencing rods slip inside the foregrip, because when the foregrip slides back, we need the tabs to spring out into the notches. We also then need to release the slide lock before we can move the runners back, but then after we do, everything can be slid back and it will automatically lock into place. Then we release the safety, pull the trigger, and guide the foregrip, and therefore also the hammer, back into place. Check that the sequencing rods are seated in the foregrip, and that gives us a completed mechanism. Of course, there's still more to go for the overall model. Next, we add the front end, which is the end of the barrel and magazine tube. It's held in place by the front end pin. Slide the foregrip forward, apply the slide lock and the last heat shield pin, and then by adding the magazine tube cap, we complete our full main assembly. Time for a quick function check of the slide lock, the safety, and the slide lock trigger behavior. The last thing to do is assemble the stock. First, we add the spring catch that holds the stock against the rear sight when it's folded. Little function check there. Then we bring in the buttstock. This is made of two parts that rotate and slide into each other, with the rotation being around the axis of the buttstock hinge itself. We lock it in place with a flat friction pin and then prevent it from flapping around by adding a spring latch. A function check shows that it will lock in the folded and unfolded positions quite sturdily. To assemble onto the receiver, we need a split pin, a holding pin, and 2 bushings. The split pin goes through one of the bushings, and that gets inserted onto one side of the frame. Once that's through, the other bushing comes in to hold the other leg of the stock onto the frame, and then the holding pin locks the split pin open, and that locks the whole fitting together. At this point, we can slap the stock in place, and then the whole thing is complete. Quick function check on the folding mechanism, open and closed. At this point, I'm going to bring in a couple of cartridges. It's very important to drop at least one. I'm going to load one into the injection port to show it can be done, and the other through the loading port as normal. Aim in a safe direction and fire them off. And safety back on, and we are done. Disassembly is basically assembling the gun, but in reverse, although there are a few differences. First, we check that the chamber is empty, but we don't pull the slide back so far as to prime the gun. Getting the front end pin out is a case of pushing it from the far side and getting a fingernail under the hook on the front side. Next, we prepare to remove the pistol grip and trigger group by unfolding the stock, and then the front end pin can be used to punch out the 2 pins that hold the trigger group in place. Sliding out the trigger group will also release the 2 loading fins. They can be pulled out and immediately set aside. We use the front end pin to punch out the holding pin of the hinge of the folding stock. With that out, we can close the jaws of the split pin, which releases the outer bushing. And once that's out, the other bushing and the split pin itself can be removed. At this point, the stock is free, and we can remove the spring latch and then push out the friction pin, which allows the buttstock to be separated from the main arm. The last part of stock disassembly is to remove the spring catch that holds the stock against the rear sight when folded. Next up is the trigger group. The first step here is to split the pistol grip, which is easier said than done because the friction pins make it really quite a stiff assembly. So the trick is to press the button on the bottom of the pistol grip, which creates a wedge effect, and that allows the whole thing to be pulled apart. With all the pins gone, we can start removing the trigger mechanism from the other half of the pistol grip, and then from here it's a case of doing basically the opposite of how we assembled it. So the rings come out, the trigger link comes out, and then we can pull everything else apart into one big pile of loose components. Moving over to the receiver and the heat shield, and the front end pin makes another appearance, pushing out the heat shield pin. Then we slide back the foregrip, which allows us to pinch the 2 runners inwards, which disconnects them from the foregrip. At that point, we can slide the foregrip out, taking off the front end as we go, and then with the foregrip fully forward, you can get a finger in to flick out the sequencing rods, which allows the foregrip to be completely removed. The runners are loose at this point, so they come right off, and then we can take out the curved heat shield pin, which now unlocks the heat shield from the receiver firing mechanism combination. That combination can now be slid out somewhat, and as soon as the clasps are free of the heat shield, they also come loose, which allows the receiver to be taken off on its own. The trigger bars come out too, as does the bolt, and then that means the receiver is completely disconnected. Separating out the extractor from the bolt is just a case of getting the T-pin out, and now we can move on to the firing mechanism. We did prime the hammer earlier as part of pulling the foregrip all the way back, so now all we need to do is slide the firing mechanism to the correct position where the notches in the firing mechanism and the heat shield are lined up, allowing us to pull out the primer. With the primer out, the handover mechanism is now totally loose, so that comes right out, and then friction is the only thing holding the firing mechanism in place, so that slides out of the heat shield quite easily. Various loose components are now free to fall right out the heat shield, so that's the rear sight, the charging door, and the 2 sequencing rods. At this point, we could simply pull the firing mechanism apart and all the components inside would be free to fall out, but the hammer is still under full tension, so first I flip the extender, and then by reinserting the primer, I can gently guide the hammer back into its resting position after releasing it with the hammer release. Of course, getting the primer back in does involve pulling out the hammer's rubber bands through the slot, just like we did when we were assembling the mechanism in the first place. Once it's safely deprimed, then the side of the mechanism comes off, and then it's just a case of removing any final pins and internal components so that the rubber bands can be separated as well. If you really want to go all the way, then you can take out the pulley and its filament axle. Although if it doesn't fall out by itself, then I usually just leave it in place.